Alright, so it seems like a few people thought that we weren't having class this week, but we are extending class this week, and it's just going to be next week that I'm going to be out. So next week you won't have to show up. Today we are going to talk about CSS. We've finally got to the point of talking about what this CSS is all about. I got a bunch of slides to look at. This is where we're going to really start diverting from the book, and the reason being is the book's going to just continue. It's going to get into a lot more detail on the very specifics of everything. What we're going to do though is the book's going to be still a great resource to reference. How I look at it right now is really a good dictionary. The way that they give it to you is kind of bland in my opinion, and then the way that they have you go through some of those tutorials or those reinforcements that we've been doing. I mean, all the answers are in the back of the book. It's really easy to understand. That's why I've been pushing on to you just to do your own kind of code outside of it, but it's definitely that mix of the two. How many of you feel pretty comfortable with HTML at this point? Decently? Okay, that's good. So you really need to know HTML to be able to get into CSS. CSS is going to reference a lot of the things that we're going to start talking about in the HTML and CSS right here. So one thing that we need to understand is how it works and how each style is applied. So we've worked with it a little bit, and there was no getting around working with styles because that's how you get certain colors in there. You get a little bit of things positioned, and I really just threw it on you guys, but I gave you most of the CSS code up to this point. After this day, I'm going to start expecting you to start researching it a little bit more and figuring out what different pieces of CSS you're going to use. So today we're just going to talk about what the heck CSS is, and then we're going to start looking at some of the specific bits of CSS. One of the ones that we're going to really focus on is positioning. Positioning is one of the ways that we can create dynamic layouts within an HTML document. Up to this point, most everything we've done has been on a kind of a stacked way. So you have one paragraph, and right underneath that you're going to have an H1, H2, something like that. Well, now we're going to get into it to where we can say, well, what if we want a box to float off to the side? We saw that in the template that I built for you guys. There's a little aside that floats off over to the side there. That's called a flow. I'm not going to go too much in depth about that today, but the idea here is we're not going to just float things to the side. We're going to actually have columns in our layout now. So we could actually have a column of navigation maybe on the left, or just some extra links that you might want to look at, or an ad, things like that. And CSS is the vehicle to get you into those layouts. We discussed tables before, and tables was the old school way that they were able to create layouts. They almost stumbled across that at one point. It was also in one of your enrichments to explain to me why tables were not the way to go about building a layout, and it's because it wasn't ever designed to be that. And it just happened to work out that putting different cells together and nesting little cells into cells was going to work for a while. Once they figured how that dirtied up the code, it really messed with the semantics of what was going on inside that code. So you wouldn't be able to tell certain things from a table from a piece of the layout, and there's so many little tags that would happen in that regard. So let's start talking a little bit more about CSS and what it is. So let me just give you a quick background as to what we're going to be talking about. So what CSS does, it's the rules that are going to tell the browser how to render elements in that HTML document. So we have one of those CSS rules down here. So does anybody want to give me an idea of what's going to happen to the H2 in our document?
The headers 2 is going to turn blue, the text is going to turn blue.
There you go.
Like a 2 pixel margin on the side.
Exactly. So this will be an EM. We'll talk about EMs. It's a unit of measurement, and it's not an actual measurement like pixels. You can count pixels. You percentages. You can. It's all going to be based off percentage. So there's not a finite number, but you can put a finite number into a percentage. This one is based off whatever the size of your font is on the browser, and then everything else kind of follows based off that font size. It's actually a really tough concept because it took me forever to really understand how those EMs work. We'll get into those EMs. It's one of the nice factors. What it can do for you, though, is it scales your text based on the device that you're on, so it always is at the right size. But it also is an issue if you're trying to have really pixel perfect layouts with words and things like that. But aside from that, we're just gonna get a little bit more vague here. So that first thing that you see in CSS is called a selector. So the selector can be a few things. We already know that this kind of selector is considered a tag. And then there was those two other types of selectors. Who wants to tell me what those two other ones are? Just yell them out. Class and ID. So there's three types of selectors that you can have up there. This demo is going to be pretty simple. We're going to just talk about the tag selector. The next thing is this whole line that you see here is that declaration. This is what we're saying what we're going to do to this particular selector. Now, it includes this first portion and the second portion. One other thing about the selector or this declaration is it does have a semicolon at the end of it. You have to have the semicolons in there so that it tells you this is the end of the declaration and there's going to be another declaration that's going to happen below it. Now the same thing's happening in regard to space with these. You don't actually have to hit the return and put this on this next line. This one doesn't have to be right below it. They can all be on the same line. They could actually all be up in one line if you wanted to really save some room. But when you're looking at CSS, you can see all the different rules that are applying to those different selectors that you have. So just make sure that you have these semicolons after each declaration. Now, you actually don't have to have a semicolon after the last declaration in CSS. It's just good practice to put it in there so you don't forget if you add more CSS to your document. All right, so the very first part of that is called a property. So that's a property you're going to change. And honestly, you're just going to have to work with CSS, and the properties you're going to start remembering them. You're going to start using them more. Color is big. Color is the side what the text is. So background color would be kind of the background of things. We have margins. We have padding. We have a bunch of different properties that you can use within CSS. Now, not every property is available for every single selector. Okay. So certain ones will be limited as to what you can use. And then the value is what's on the end of that whole property or that declaration there. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about the style sheets that we have. So you probably don't realize this, but there's already style sheets working in our documents, the ones that we've been doing that didn't even seemingly have style sheets before. So there's actually a few types of style sheets. There's 3 of them that get applied, okay? So let's start just breaking it down and look at the various styles that we have. Okay, so browser style sheets. We've already worked with those. The browser style sheets are things that are applied to your document by default. So when we just go in and put our HTML, put a head in there, and then put a few tags within the body, and then we bring it up in our browser, it's already going to do a few things. It's going to make the H1s a little bit bigger, H2 a little smaller, all the way down to H6. Those are the browser styles. They're default to the browser. Now, for the most part, most of the browsers are pretty consistent across the board, so you'll get the same result pretty much through all browsers, but there might be a little bit of tweaks on some of the browsers that you have out there, so just take note that you can't 100% rely on browser styles. Plus, you really wouldn't want to because it's a super old school way to think about things. User styles. So now users can actually apply their own style sheets to a document within their browser. Can anybody give me a reason as to why somebody might want to put their own style sheet into a browser?
Disabilities.
There's one of the big ones, disabilities. Being able to see some text. So if you go to a site, somebody has a really ridiculous background, they have a lot of little small text, but it's text they want to read, they may be applying a style to their document. So it's going to overwrite your styles, and then you can see what those styles would look like based off of their rendering. So those inline style sheets, somebody might just the user style sheet, they might just custom write that themselves and apply it to all the pages they see on the website. So they're there, just realize that's something that would happen within a style sheet. And then the author style sheets, those are the ones that we're going to start working with. So those are the ones that are going to reference all your CSS, the CSS to your HTML. You're going to write those, you're going to have the control of how those work. But what we need to start doing is talking about how those 3 style sheets work together and which ones overwrite which ones, because that's pretty important. Certain ones are going to take precedence over other ones. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's not just top to bottom. There's other factors that go into that. Styles that are lower down on your page are actually going to be applied last. So those particular styles will actually be the ones that have more precedence in certain scenarios. there's a lot of other things that come into play though once you start looking at style. So we're going to go through that today. There's going to be one area called, I can't even barely say it, but specificity. And it's like a mathematical equation as to which particular style will overwrite another style. And I'm not going to make you be calculating these different specificities, but once you start seeing it, you'll see how things get complicated once you get a little bit further into CSS. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the author styles. So there's really 3 methods that you can add CSS styles to a document. And we've actually used a few of those methods already. Actually, all of them. You probably didn't write one of them though. The very first one is inline styles. So inline, you're putting it right inside of your tag. And you make this, this little attribute here, style equals, and then you put everything in quotes. So it looks pretty similar to what we were looking at in style sheets as well. You have these different properties and then these different values that you can add to it. Now, inline styles are great. That used to be the only way you could style HTML documents. So it's kind of crazy because if you had a huge document and you had to put all these styles in there, can you think how mucked up it would look with all these extra styles in there? And then let's say you had all your links and you wanted them to all be blue, and then somebody wants to change them to green. You have to go in, maybe do a find and replace, or manually go through that code and find all those little pieces of code. So it wasn't really a great way to do it, but inline styles do have their purpose in certain instances. Maybe you're doing a quick prototype, you want to throw an inline style in there, see what it looks like. Sometimes I'll just throw an inline style on an element that I absolutely know that I'm going to use it one time, and I'm being a little bit lazy sometimes. I don't want to throw it in my style sheet. So you can use that method. Now, inline styles, for the most part, are going to overwrite all the other styles that might be applied to a particular tag and things like that. But we'll see how those might be overwritten in certain elements. Okay, so header styles. That's when we take the style sheet and we put it right in between the head tags of our document. So it's not a separate document at this point, it's inside the document that we're working with. So you make this declaration at the top that says, styles, type, and these are the styles, and then you can list all those styles in the top of your document. It's okay, you can do that. It really separates the two together. Reasons that I've used it, maybe you're making a quick prototype for a client, and you don't want to try to send them 5 files via email. You can go ahead and put it all in one document, send that to your client, and they're able to render that web page in one HTML page. Sometimes you just want to keep everything in that same document together. Also, let's see what else we could do with header styles. Sometimes there's some JavaScript you might use, and it will use a header style so it could apply things a little bit differently. Okay, and then there's the external style sheets. So these are the ones that we're going to link to a sheet that's completely separate than what we have in our HTML document. And you'll see that we have this link in here. It's already in your templates. You can link to multiple style sheets within your document. This is a good point to point out that if you had a link to a style sheet and then you had another style sheet that you link to, the one that's second is going to override some of the styles that might be in that first one. So let's get into it a little bit deeper because that's where we really need to start focusing, is what's going to overwrite what. Before I do move on, there is a thing called an @import. So it gets a little bit more in depth. You have this style sheet. We're linking to something called My Styles. That's this document that's sitting off in a folder somewhere. In a style sheet, you can link to another style sheet. So you have to use the @import for that. So there's these multiple ways to get that. There's some issues with doing it various different ways. So for example, if you link directly into the head of your HTML document, this style is going to probably render a lot faster than doing the import, because what happens in the browser is it kicks to this file, it goes and it renders everything in your style sheet. With the @imports, it usually goes to your style sheet, reads everything from your style sheet, and then it does the import in your file. So it's kind of the order of things of how the browser renders your files. Sometimes there's a lot of debate right now if @import is the better way to do it inside of a style sheet or just using a link right into your HTML document. I typically go the HTML route. It seems like my styles render a lot quicker. Okay, so let's start talking a little bit about the rules of CSS. So the browsers have to deal with all these rules, all these different style sheets coming in. So we have an H1 in our document. It's going to render that browser style, but then you're going to have your little declaration you put in there, and it's going to have to render then that style again. So that's where the cascading comes into effect. It's going to look at whatever cascaded style is last, or whichever has the most importance in your document, and it's going to apply that style to your document. So let's jump in and start talking about how those things get rendered out. Like I just said, it's going to be coming in from all areas. You're going to have those external style sheets, you have the ones in the header, and of course the ones that we see in line. So once we get into a conflict situation, this is where some things have to go down, and we have to start understanding as to which style is going to take precedence. So in this particular example, we have two conflicting rules, one right over the other, red and blue. Anyone want to take a guess of which one's going to render in browser?
Red.
Right, red, because it's just underneath it. So you got two rules right here, and then that one's going to go. Okay, so it could also be between two sheets. So that one was in the same sheet, one right under another. Two different sheets. You got your browser sheet and your author sheet. Red should actually take precedence in that one as well. And then there's another one, so you can have a few sheets. You can see how it starts to get more complex. And when you start getting really big style sheets, like these are really easy examples to see, but once you get a big style sheet, you may not even realize that you put a rule way up here, and then you have that same rule down in the lower in the style sheet. And you're like, what the hell? This one has red on it. And you never look down far enough, and you realize you have another one that says blue at the bottom. So this is where that organization that I've been always preaching since the beginning of the semester comes into play. Is organization is probably half the battle with HTML, CSS, or anything like that. Because if you don't have everything organized, once you get back to debugging something or figuring out what the issue is, then you're going to just be looking at a mess of code. I mean, it would make me sick to look at that kind of code. So when I see some of the grading that I've done, I know a few of you need to focus on being a little bit more organized in your code. Make sure you nest everything properly. That way you're going to have a lot less issues going on as you go forward. But that aside, let's go ahead and...
Question?
Yes?
On your other sheet 2, that would be like a separate page within your parent HTML. Is that only going to render for that sheet 2, or is it going to take precedent back up to sheet 1 as well?
So these, let's just say this example, these two style sheets are linked into the same HTML document. Okay? And so this sheet might have been listed first, and then this sheet was listed second. So since this was listed second, and this is the last rule that was applied, it's going to apply it to green.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start looking at which rules win. So we're going to start getting into it, and you'll see why you're going to regret it in a minute here. Okay, so step 1, not too bad. We're going to gather all the declarations that apply to the element property, and we're going to be able to take a look at that. So, all right, find any declarations that matches these different things. So here's our gathered declarations. But basically what we're doing is we're looking at a style sheet, and we're going to go and gather all these declarations and see which one wins out. Here's the 3 style sheets that we got going right now. So we've got a browser sheet, a user sheet, author sheet. Now, this one is specifically talking about an H2 that's sitting in a nav ID. Okay, so we're just targeting one H1. Now these H2s are for the entire document. So this one's going to be the one that wins in the nav. These will not overwrite the navs, but any H2s in the nav will be this color. Any H2s that are just anywhere else in the document outside of this nav will be blue. So you kind of have 2 different colors that are going on in that scenario, because we're being pretty specific right here, and we're saying, hey, take a look at that nav in the H2. Okay? So there's going to be more declarations in this process, so we're going to go to step 2 and start taking a look at what goes on in the next step. So there's a thing called an important tag, and it looks like this. It has an exclamation and important. And what that does is it says that this is the absolute most important declaration that you've made in this CSS style, and it's going to actually apply that one no matter where it's at within your style sheets. So let's take a look at that. So that's how you would actually write it in CSS. Now I don't want everyone just to go in there and putting important on every single little thing in their document, because that's not the proper way to adjust your style sheets. But there are scenarios where you'll need to use important, because maybe something has to be above another one, and and you have to make sure that that one gets applied, but there's some other styles that are a little bit lower down that don't get applied. So important is one that kind of throws everything out of that precedence kind of stacking order like we just looked at. Okay, so yeah, it's going to override the normal declarations, all that's talking about. So let's look at how these other declarations are going to be sorted out. So it's usually sorted in this kind of a list. You want to take a look at it from the lowest to highest. So the browser styles are the very first one, not as important as the next one, which is just our normal user style declarations. Again, that user style is what they've applied in their browser. We're going to go up to those normal declarations there. That's going to be in the style sheet. We got the important declarations that go in the author sheet. But then look again here, important in the user style sheet actually override everything below that, or above it, however you want to look at it. So the reason for that is if you put something really ridiculous in your code and somebody absolutely cannot see it, they want to put that important tag on there to completely override that stuff that was going on so that they can read it, whatever is going on in that scenario. Does that make sense thus far? Any questions? All right. I know I'm probably boring you. I was always bored in lectures, but I have to do this because you have to look at this. This PDF, by the way, is listed in your class, so you can kind of go through it in our Quest 6. So if there's no other declarations that exist, obviously that first one's going to win. So you don't really adjust that browser style sheet. That one's going to beat that browser declaration, and finally those author styles are going to go ahead and beat out all the other ones above it. And then finally there's our important declaration, and that's going to beat out everything else that's in our document right now. I think I have an example here too with this declaration. So in this scenario, in this user style sheet, red is the clear winner. Okay, I think that's good. So if two of them have the same importance, that's where the questions really come into play. So you have two of them that have the same importance. Let's see here. So basically, they're one right after another. We just kind of talked about that. Go to step 3. This is where it starts getting complex. We're going to start talking about how to score CSS so that we can go in there and figure out which one's going to win. All right, let's just jump into it. So we have our selectors here, and these are a little bit more complex. We have this nav h2 and then the h2.intro. These two examples are somewhat similar. So what this one's saying is in this ID, go and change any h2 that happens within that nav and change it to blue. In this example, we're directly saying, hey, there's an h2 that has the class of intro, and we're only going to do the ones that have class of intro. So it's directly just talking about only h2s that have this particular class associated with them. So this one is kind of considered, it's more of like a direct selector, so you're going and you're focusing on one little element, whereas this one, you're looking at an element and everything that it contains within it. So you're talking about all the h2s that happen in that element. Okay, so here's where the scores come into play. So what you're going to do is you're going to have these scores that you list out, and they're going to be listed from A, B, C, D, and it's basically a chain score. So we're going to talk about each of these ABCs, how you get this score, and you're going to get some numbers, and then those numbers are going to determine which one gets actually wins out. So this is where that specificity comes into play. So we take a look at it. We're going to show you how it gets calculated. So we're going to look at inline elements as this A line. Okay, so we have one inline style that's happening within this H2 right now. So you get 1 point. And then all these other areas have 0, so your specificity is 1, 0, 0, 0. Okay? So if you look at an ID now, that's where you count that. You have one ID, and that's the B, so you're going to have 1. I mean, it's going to be the same for these next two, so you kind of have the same thing with classes and the elements. So those are the breakdowns. That's why you have the A, B, C, D. Simple thus far, because you're able to easily see that there's one class here, one element, and it's applying those different numbers to it. So there's the specificity of those few elements. So let's talk about what's going on. Why do we have those 4 different areas there? So the A will always win out on B, and so on down the line, all the way down to D. So D is kind of like the redheaded stepchild, if you will, of those complicated specificity. Okay, so let's take a look at it. Now, let's see what, let me see what I must have put that on there for reasonableness. So they're talking about which one's going to win out in these particular scenarios. Important will typically win out in all scenarios that that's being utilized, but for the most part, those ones are going to work like this. The IDs cannot overwrite the inline style. So what that means is we have 1 all the way through 10 different IDs in this top style sheet. Down here, we have 1 inline style. So this is for our inline style, and here's our 10. So since this 1 is before this 10, it wins out actually. So this style is going to be applied before any of these styles would be applied. Confusing yet? Okay. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't ever have to really get that in depth with this, but you got to understand that this is how it's being calculated. It's not just based off of where these rules are sitting in our pages. So if you start getting a little bit more complex, maybe in a few years you're working in design and you start thinking of this specificity, then you can be like, okay, I remember something about it, and then go look it up, and you can start doing some more information on it. So same thing with classes. You're not going to be able to overwrite a class or an ID with a lot of the classes. So there's a whole bunch of classes that we're trying to apply this color green, but the div is going to, or the ID is going to beat out that one because it comes right before it. Okay? Same thing with the last one. And that's just our classes and external styles. All right, so now if we get a little bit more complex, I'm going to probably just gloss over a little bit of this. This is how it gets a little bit more complex. So at this point, we're looking at 2 different things in here. First off, we have our ID, so they get a 1 tick there. But then we also have this H2 element, so that gets its tick. Now you have 2 different values that are in that specificity. So you have another element, and you calculate it out, it's going to have the 1 and the 2, or 2 ones in there. And then there's also pseudo classes. Right now we're not comparing these, we're just like calculating how it hits out. So you're looking at that ID, and then you're counting out the various elements in there. And then these are also called pseudo classes. So what a pseudo class is, anybody have an idea or want to take a guess as to what a pseudo class might do? So we have an A tag right here with this colon and then this hover at the end.
Next and then I don't change color.
Basically it's like a reaction to something that might happen to that element. So in this case, A has a few of these pseudo elements. You have like a hover state, you have a click state, you have a few different states that you might have. So those also get calculated into those that class side. So you do have to count those as well. Okay, so the specificity, you have 1, 1, 3 with a 0 at the beginning. And then if you take it and you change it around and you just have one pseudo element in there, you can take a look at how that looks. I'm just going to skip over this one because we're not going to really talk about this, but there's attribute selectors that can be in there. So the CSS can start looking a little different. We're going to probably stay away from most of this for the next few weeks so you really get into what CSS is, and we can start talking about how it looks at things. So depending on what kind of CSS, there's extra little things that you can add to the end of it to make it only affect certain children of that particular element, or a few children deep. Do you understand what I mean when I say children? Anybody get that a little bit? Okay, so what it is if you had let's say you had a paragraph tag, and then inside that paragraph tag you had a block quote tags. So the block quote is a child of the paragraph tag, because it's inside of the paragraph tag. It's one deep. It gets, I can see a little bit of confused faces out there. Okay, it's kind of with what we're doing with nesting. When you nest something into something, that becomes a child of whatever you're nesting it into. We'll do a demo in a second here. All right, so if there's no clear winner, You have the same specificity. Let's go to step 4. So the latter one wins. We already talked about that. So if you have the same exact number of values, the second one's going to win. Okay. All right, so we're going to just play a little bit of a game right now. We're going to see if you guys can figure out which CSS style is going to win. Okay. So which one's going to win in this scenario? Go ahead and call it out. These two? Nobody knows?
Green.
Green. It's because user styles overwrites the browser styles. Okay? All right. I'm going to do that lecture again if nobody starts throwing out these these answers. Okay. Which one's going to win in this scenario? Blue. Why?
Often styles may not use their browser.
Yep. Beats out those due to its placement there. You're going to get a little bit more complex, so. Okay, which one's going to win out in this guy?
Purple.
Yep, purple. So if you calculated the specificity, you could actually figure that out. But also, inline styles typically beat out everything above it.
You're going to do a test on this, aren't you?
I probably will. Yeah, we haven't had a test yet here, so I don't know if you guys thought I forgot about testing, but it'll be a practical test. I'm not, maybe a few multiple choice questions, but mostly practical. All right, so which one's going to win in this one?
It'll at least be green.
Yeah. Yeah. So why is that one? Because it has that.
Because it has the important tag.
Exactly. Okay. Now which one's going to win?
Purple. We both have an important, but inline beats out.
Everything.
Okay, you're right. Good job. You're getting it.
Purple. Still purple.
Remember what we said about the importance before? User style sheet, because of the accessibility kind of thing, they may need to override one of your style sheets. So this is one of the scenarios where that user style is actually going to overwrite that. That's kind of a trick one. Okay. So we're in the author style sheet right now. Which one is going to be applied? Let's see here.
Well, it depends. The one that is specifically class news would be.
You have to do it based off of specificity, so it gets a little bit more complex. So the news one's going to win in all these scenarios, and I guess I could have phrased the question better because this one will always overwrite this one is all I'm saying. So for the most part, there might be a whole bunch of blue H2s in your document, but anything that has that news class will overwrite this H2 class, even if it comes below it. Because we're being very specific too. We're adding a little bit of extra. So that word specificity, I mean, it means more specific than another tag or another thing. So we're specifically saying, hey, this H2 that has this news class has to be this color. We're going to have to start using these, and a lot of the CSS is going to be very subjective. It's like, what am I going to apply to this document to make it look right? So there's not going to be one way that I'm going to tell you to put these tags into your CSS document. You might stack them a little bit differently. I always try to put all my tags at the top, the ones that I change out, and then as I start going down, I break my styles sheet up into sections. So I know, here's all the styles that associate with my navigation, here's all my style sheets that associate with other elements of my page. So there's a lot that can go into your style sheet. You're going to have to develop this style of doing it. Some people like to break out all their things into separate style sheets. So you might have your nav completely in a different sheet than you have your layout. It's up to you how you feel like you want to organize it, but you're going to start running into problems when you start putting these things in certain orders, and then you're going to need to be able to sort that out using these tools here. Okay, so again, here's an external style sheets, and we're going to do in the header styles. Which one will win out here?
Gray. All right.
That's correct. So they have the same specificity, these two here. But it's just because this one, since they are basically equal, that bottom is going to win. Okay, we can win in this one. Which one is the one that's going to be applied most specifically?
The ID one.
Okay. You guys getting this? Who's not getting it right now? I mean, so just let me know because I want to make sure you get this because once we go on, if you don't speak up now, I'm going to assume that you got what's going on. We're going to start building style sheets up. It's going to be the next thing that we need to work with. Okay. Which line? Okay. See, a lot of these ones are more calculations right now, but for the most part, you can kind of figure it out. You don't have to go and do the math all the way through, but just knowing the difference between this symbol and this period, you get that right, that this means that this is an ID, this means that it's a class, okay?
I think it's basically just knowing like the class will be done, and an ID will be done across.
Exactly. If you know that A, B, C, D, then you're going to understand kind of what wins out what. So we're going to be done for today because that's a lot to absorb, and honestly, I'm going to call it a day today. I wanted to let you guys work a little bit more on your projects if you wanted to work on them in class, so I could be here to answer any questions. And I'm talking about the kitchen or the restaurant project. I want to give you some in-class time to use Photoshop because I know that I'm asking you to add some images in there. So if you want to use the class time, that's fine. If you don't, you're free to go. If there's any other questions though, with CSS, go ahead, Jake.
Well, it's actually, did you end up ever uploading or sharing that image that we're supposed to use for the logo? Because I created one.
It's in Blackboard.
It's in Blackboard in the class.
Yeah, you'll just have to download it off of that.
Oh, I must have missed it.
Yeah, so it's in there right now, and all I wanted you to do is just take that image, and then you can do whatever you need to it. Not change the image itself, but just pretend like I was your hiring you, and I said, here's my logo. Make
Okay.
this work in the assignment.
Hopefully it works with what I have, but
If not, that's okay.
Okay, is there any other questions, anything outside of CSS today? Okay, thanks, and, all right.
Alright, I'm gonna need to look at this then.
There's no weekend.
Alright, and I fixed that. I fixed the, this, and that was a table, and that was a table, so that was a table.
That's good. Yes, you did. You're saying this right here, right?
Yeah, that's a table. Yeah, this is.
I want to go sit there.
Well, these are like my favorite stuff I do for you.
Hey.
Which I was looking at the days and I'm like, this is gonna be good.
Oh, yeah, I know.